Hello, everyone. Welcome to the June 20th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk meeting with MakerDAO. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development. I keep on forgetting that. I believe that's accurate. Today, we're going to be talking about, we're going to be tightening up the agenda slightly because we have a significant amount of science to crank through. Cyrus Younessi is going to introduce us to the wonderful world of collateral risk and everything that entails. I'm not going to describe it any more than that because I've probably used the wrong terminology, so I'll allow him to keep us informed. We'll hear from Vishesh about the state of the peg. Briefly, for about 10 minutes, Cyrus, we're going to dig into his slideshow for the bulk of the call. I am going to restrict myself to 5 minutes of preamble today, so I'm going to talk real fast. If you have questions, comments, please do not feel shy, jump right in. We have a chat, type your questions in the chat if you don't have access to a microphone. If you do have access to a microphone, interrupt us whenever you need to, and we can have the discussions as they arise. I think that's probably it for the boilerplate. I want to talk briefly about governance issues because we're seeing some interesting things happening again. Our poll this week up until the 11th hour was weighted towards a 15.5% stability fee. So the community had signaled for lowering it by 1%. And we might have seen the first example of an emergent behavior, which I'm happy about. We might have seen campaigning for the first time, which is great because this is something that we need to encourage as a group and support whenever possible. People need to be involved with the system. They need to know that their involvement can affect people's opinions, can affect the way that the system works. We had some people pop up in the chat yesterday saying, OMG, why are people advocating for a lower stability fee? There was a conversation there. People dug into the graphs, and then somebody posted a thread in MakerGov saying essentially the same thing. Why are you all advocating for lowering the fee when it should be raised? There's a comment or two, but I don't know if this is coincidental or not, but the weight staked in that poll had moved since that post went up, and now it's advocating for a 1% increase. We'll leave it to Vishesh to present data about whether that seems to be the most logical option. What I'm far more interested in, though, is the fact that people determined that the system was moving in a way that they didn't like. They piped up, they had some chats, they made some posts, and then the system changed. And that's very encouraging to me. So that's the sunshine aspect. Here's the contrarian view here. We're still in a situation where we're running into voter apathy, and this isn't a surprise. It's not something we weren't prepared for. This is the nature of the game, and we have some questions I think that we need to ask ourselves related around, specifically related to the cadence of voting, the friction associated with voting, our expectation or requirements that the community needs to be engaged on a weekly basis. And they need to educate themselves, stay up to date, and then move their keys or find their keys and then move their maker every Friday. There seems to be a differing sentiment in the community about that's just the nature of the beast and that's what people need to do. I am not sure that I'm convinced to do that. And one of the thought experiments that I do, and this is not a complicated one, I ask myself, Rich, name 5 projects in the space that you'd be willing to do the same thing for, and the answer is none. I would not do that for any project in this space. So we need to determine whether that's a realistic expectation for asking people to interact with our system. I don't want to sound too prejudicial. I think that there's middle grounds. There's other options that we can explore, and one of those things I would like to refer everybody's attention to is a recap of these thoughts that I've posted in the MakerGov subreddit. Somebody talking about Rich Without a Hat? Yeah, today is my Baldy reminder day, just so it's not a big surprise if I take my hat off 6 months from now. All right, so I'm posting a link in the chat. this recaps some of the questions that we'd asked previously. So that come from the community, come from me, come from these discussions. Are we seeing engagement fatigue? Is 1% increments too fine-grained? Are 10 plus polling options too confusing? Are people tempted to fiddle with the rate if we're moving things up and down by 1%? Are we asking people to vote on weekends? Well, we are. Is that a bad idea? Or does that not matter? The list of questions go on and on and on. I'm not going to read them all out because I promised to only talk for 5 minutes, and I've already broken that promise. The interesting thing about this is that it puts us into a situation where we have one signaling method available to us, and that's the poll in the voting portal. That poll is used every week to talk about the stability fee. So in order to change the cadence of the system, we need to figure out a signaling system that's outside of the system that we can use. My quick and dirty solution to that problem is a Reddit thread with contest mode turned on. 2 comments. One is risk parameter should be 2 weeks. One is risk parameter should be 1 week.
What is contest mode?
It's when it randomizes the order of the comments, and it hides the replies under the assumption that people have a tendency to vote for whatever the first 1 or 2 things they read are. So this is not scientific governance at all, but it is a signaling method that we can use to figure out whether there's enough interest to keep on pursuing this thing. I think the diminishing Venn diagram problem is happening here, where we have serious people that are engaged in the system, people that are willing to hold an opinion about the system, people are willing to do something about the system, and then that Venn diagram gets smaller and smaller when you get into people that are actually refreshing MakerGov on a daily basis or on the weekends to figure out whether there's a contest mode thread. So that leads us to a situation where the comment for every 2 weeks for voting cadence has 7 votes, and the comment for the voting cycle should remain at 1 week has 5 votes. So this is not an enormous turnout. I've decided to leave that thread up again, and for the course of this week and up until the next poll, I want to keep on collecting some signals. So if you have an opinion, please click on that link that I posted in the side in the chat. Pick one of those options or add a comment. I think I'm going to, yeah, I'll cut myself off here. One of the things I do want to add, though, is that there's an interesting suggestion in that thread as well from Long for Wisdom, who's become an increasingly engaged stakeholder with some cool ideas. He points out one of those things that every once in a while, in retrospect, seems obvious. Why didn't we do this from the very beginning? But he points out that there's it might be smart to do rate stepping for the stability fees in exponential increases. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4% plus or minus, we should perhaps consider steps of 0.5, 1, 2, 4, and 8, which allows us to do some fine-grained adjustments to the polls when required, but it also opens the door for us to do drastic changes to the polls, to the stability fee in the poll as well, which might be interesting if we see some dangerous market activity. I believe that is it for me. I think I've mostly cranked through the things that I wanted to talk about in my allotted time. I did. I just checked my notes. So Cyrus, I'm going to hand this off to you to pick up if you want to start telling us all about risk.
Sure. Well, I guess we'll start with monetary policy, right? Vishesh.
Sure.
I don't have the agenda in front of me. That's next, right?
Yes. 10 minutes for Vishesh. Clock has started.
Okay. All right. So if you all can see my screen properly, I think the simple answer is things have by and large been going well. For DAI, the price has been broadly stable. There's been a little bit of a drift down, very slight, so hard to say whether it's a legitimate problem or not. And then we'll talk about supply a little bit. So the price, as we've seen over the past month, a lot of the past volatility has kind of come down quite a bit, so that's good. Since the 16.5% stability fee, the price has drifted down a little bit. There was this June 15th spike, which I think is a bit of an outlier, something to exclude, and we can go into why. But sort of if you take that data point out, it has broadly drifted down a little, but again, very slight. So what's interesting is the ETH price, although has been fairly strong over the past month, has actually not changed significantly in magnitude, only from the like 250 range to 268 more recently. And the DAI price has kind of held steady as well. We haven't seen a strong drift in either direction, but we have seen more of this kind of positive correlation emerge at these higher ETH price levels, which, as we've kind of beat to death at this point, was a bit of a reversal from how things had worked in the past. That may start to resume again soon, which is something that I think will be interesting to dive into, is under what conditions does DAI sort of do well when ETH does well versus do poorly when ETH does well. So the supply actually, and this was the blip that I was talking about, has ticked up quite a bit in the past week. So we'd kind of gone, or 2 weeks, I suppose, we'd kind of gone up from about 80 million to 85, which is not insignificant. And that kind of coincided very well with the 17.5% decrease, and then again to 16.5%. What's interesting was there was a large amount of DAI minted on June 15th through, I think it was 2 large draws. And then again, more DAI minted again on the 16th, but also a fair amount burned on that day. So those kind of evened out a bit. So the supply is ticked up. What I think there were a few large positions that had kind of come back to Maker from some of the secondary lending platforms. And that seemed to pretty clearly be a delayed effect from the 16.5% decrease. I don't know if people were maybe waiting to see if that fee would get increased back again or further decreased before they made their decision. But there was definitely some sort of reverse refinancing back to Maker. As far as the circulation of debt, I think we saw pretty clearly that the moment the stability fee hit that 19.5% level, there was this precipitous drop in the average age of debt. That had kind of really halted around the 16.5% decrease, and has broadly kind of sat at a flat level since then. So I think fewer people, the rate of the amount of loans that are getting paid back has really stopped changing. So it's a bit of a steady state right now. As far as the new versus old CDPs, what we've seen is just kind of a consistent decrease in the amount of debt that's being drawn out of new CDPs versus pre-existing ones. And that's really kind of been exaggerated since the 17.5 and 16.5% stability fee decreases. Now, the reason I kind of harp on those is you could argue that it was some fundamental change in ETH price, but as we've kind of seen, ETH price did not significantly change in that overall like 3 to 4 week time span. There were some small movements in a 2 to 3 day time period within that, but overall it was not a huge magnitude change. So it wouldn't really explain some of these like month-long trends. So the collateralization ratio, again, with that same June 15th-ish timeline, had started to rise up a bit more. So as the stability fee was decreased to 17.5% and then again to 16.5%, we saw that collateralization ratio coming down, and we saw, I think that was a bit of a delayed effect, again, from some of the deleveraging behavior and moving debt onto other platforms. People commensurately reduced the amount of collateral. And so it also contributes. But what's interesting is as the rates became a little bit more attractive again, people refinanced back to Maker a little bit, the supply increased a bit, and the collateralization ratio had started to come up again. So those are kind of balancing effects. What's interesting is in the past, we might have seen that happen, and then we would see the collateralization ratio drop as well, because people were getting aggressive and they were really hyper leveraging on ETH. So even though they may be moving their loans back to Maker, doesn't seem to be as much of that risk-seeking behavior. And so the collateralization ratio has maintained kind of this elevated level. So unfortunately, Coinbase Pro decided to do a 45-minute maintenance update exactly during this call. So I have a screen grab of the DAI price breakdown for you here. And by the end of the call, it should be back up. So what we'd kind of seen was more, in the past 2 weeks of this kind of a spread where there's a significant amount of DAI trading below $1, but overall the price had kind of stayed fairly steady. And honestly, this looks like a fairly wide spread, but if you kind of think about the magnitude of those values, between 0.98 and 1.02 is not a huge spread, and is honestly, it dies in a much better shape than it was 2-3 months ago. It's just maybe a very slight drift down since the 16.5% decrease. And I think that's something that you can see in the stablecoin charts as well. To just kind of touch on the secondary lending in my last 2 minutes here. So what's interesting is the overall outstanding borrow and supply volumes on the secondary lending platforms in the longer time scale, as we talked about, kind of exploded, but since then has actually held fairly steady. So even though the supply overall has increased somewhat significantly, the amount of DAI that is being borrowed and supplied on these secondary lending platforms has been fairly steady. So that kind of increase in supply is primarily attributed to Maker, which is interesting, because I think what we'd seen in the past at the 19.5% level was a strong preference for going towards some of those secondary lending platforms, which, as you know, has been discussed about the relationship of secondary lending rates to the stability fee, and the fact that that kind of serves a similar function to what the DSR should eventually do, suggests that perhaps 19.5% was a bit of an overshoot, but that somewhere in that 16.5, maybe 17% range is somewhat of a steady state, at least for the current conditions. So that is about 9 minutes. Rich.
All right, I appreciate your attendance to the clock. I have I'm going to break the rules. I have a question. So we generally look at secondary lending platforms as being actually led or potentially driving the stability fee equilibrium at MakerDAO. I'm curious though whether you think that the debt ceiling might have an impact on this function as well, just 1 or 2 steps down the road. So obviously there's only 100 million that's going to come out of the system. There's inventory levels that increase and decrease, and then that impacts the deviation from the peg. But is ultimately, so yeah, maybe I'm wandering around a bit too much, but do you think that the debt ceiling can have an impact on the usage on these secondary lending platforms, or whether it's a completely separate metric altogether?
I think the debt ceiling really comes into play as you start to get closer to it. There's still a bit of a buffer to that range, but I think the question of how should we think about these secondary lending platforms, what can we learn from that, and like to what extent should we let it drive our decisions? Ultimately, I think the secondary lending platforms are serving this function of eating up inefficiency, right? So to the extent that the DAI supply significantly outpaces the demand for DAI, secondary lending platforms come in and sort of ease that pain. And that's effectively a similar function to what the DSR should be doing. And so, you might see a significant portion of volume, if everything is properly calibrated, move to the DSR versus secondary lending platforms in the future, because again, it's ultimately economically the same effect. Now, what that means is currently, if we see not a lot of movement on secondary lending platforms, but we do see an increase in supply and a depression in the DAI price, then we may have undershot the stability fee, and it's cheaper to draw DAI out of Maker. But given the collateral parameters and given the potential yields you can get on those secondary lending platforms, unfortunately, rates are not perfectly transferable across platforms. May still mean that people would prefer to go to Maker and would prefer to draw DAI out of Maker, and those secondary lending rates may not necessarily move commensurately, because they may be at somewhat of a steady state for those particular collateral parameters on those other platforms, right? Because there's a lot of other interplaying factors that come into play in reality. So ultimately, the DSR is not going to kill those secondary lending platforms, because there are a lot of other factors in play in terms of, I can use DAI as collateral to go short on some other asset on DYDX, while at the same time getting a lending yield out of that DAI. And so it's a little bit more complex than that kind of simple relationship. And so I think for a lot of reasons, you don't necessarily want to let the information about what's going on those secondary platforms drive what's going on in Maker. But at the same time, it is a useful data point for understanding to what extent oversupply exists.
Rich, you're muted.
Rich, you're on mute.
All right. There's a question in the side chat from Patrick OD. Do you have access to a mic, Patrick, or do you want us to read this out for you? Or have Vishesh read it? No mic. So Vishesh, can you see that, or should you want me to read that to you?
I can see it. So it seems like I've moved from looking at price in terms of current price versus moving average versus outright price. I'm not sure I got the difference between current versus outright price, but yeah, so I can sort of explain what I think the relative usefulness is in the moving average versus the current price. The current price, and again, I'm assuming you're referring to the spread and the bar chart. That's helpful for me, at least, to understand, looking at not just what's the volume weighted average price over time, but sort of within that, kind of like the microstructures of, what kinds of spreads are we seeing on different platforms? Where does, ETH to DAI tend to trade? Okay, well, it tends to be closer to $1, and then Uniswap has this wider spread. Like, understanding a little bit of the dynamics of where DAI is trading and what are some of the patterns of how it trades on those different platforms, at least for me, helps me understand, like, as a dynamic function, what DAI looks like. Okay, ETH price. Okay, so that's for DAI. Then for ETH price, what I was looking at for the longer running average before was kind of these broader trends and the relationship between ETH in the long term versus ETH in the short term, and how that impacts DAI. Because in the past, we were just kind of coming up to speed on this idea that the ETH price relative to the long-term price changes how attractive it is, and how much people want to go long or short on it, which then impacted DAI price. What's interesting now is, I think that behavior probably still exists. It's probably a little bit muted now that ETH has come up in price a little bit, but I imagine that relationship still exists, and it seems to just be impacting DAI a little bit less, which is, I think, a positive marker for the resiliency of DAI to that leveraging behavior, because in the past, that leveraging behavior was much more effective at depressing the DAI price.
All right, thanks, Vishesh. Trying to stay cognizant of the time. We're at 1/2 the hour. So Cyrus, do you want to unleash your slide deck for us?
Sure. One second. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So today we're going to start talking a little bit about the quantitative side of things. Okay, so quick recap from last week. Last week we mainly talked about the qualitative and fundamental side of a collateral asset. We looked at kind of a rough sketch on what we want to examine for a particular collateral asset. I know we don't get into a ton of detail on it. I think it just makes more sense to kind of run through the entire model. And then when we circle back to looking at specific collateral assets, we can get a little bit more detailed on examining an asset and talking about scoring frameworks. But essentially, the goal was to take everything we know about a particular collateral and turn it into some sort of risk rating. And we haven't exactly talked about how that risk rating comes in yet, where it impacts the final risk parameters, but we will. And also, obviously, up to this point, we haven't used any information about the markets, trading, liquidity, or any of that. Quick reminder, this was kind of the overall outline process. We did skip, actually, the first step, the collateral onboarding process, which we will return to, I think, either next week or the following week, waiting on some documentation to be released so that we can go over it. Last week's due diligence, and now we're on quantitative modeling. And then today's outline, or I should say the outline for the next however many weeks it takes to get through this, certainly not a one-day thing. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the goals and strategy of what we're trying to achieve with the quant models, talk about inputs and outputs, kind of some background information, building blocks. I think really these first three sections is what we're going to be able to get to today, but if we have time, we can start looking at a single CDP credit risk model. Afterwards, liquidation ratio, putting a bunch of assets into portfolio, and then looking at debt ceilings. Okay, so first section, goals and strategy. What are we trying to do and how are we going to do it? So first, a few philosophical goals. The MakerDAO mission, DAI becomes the first unbiased world currency, kind of the tagline for this project. The risk side of things, or the decentralized risk function, should, of course, help support that mission. And the role of risk is to promote the stability and integrity of DAI. We want to help, obviously we want to grow the DAI supply, but we want to do it safely and responsibly. And we want to create sensible approaches to hard problems. And as we will see over the coming weeks, there's a few hard problems that we just gotta get our hands around. And how do we achieve these philosophical goals? I've said it a million times, but we have to be patient and prudent. There's no other way around it. If we rush through these models, I think we will be setting ourselves up for not a fun time. Operational goals. First step is just defining what these risk parameters represent. I think there's actually still, to this day, a lot of confusion about what the purpose of the different risk parameters are. What exactly are we looking for in the stability fee and the debt ceiling, and even the liquidation ratio can sometimes be a little bit tricky to understand. So first, we want to just understand what these parameters do. We want to build the right models to calculate these parameters. We want to examine the weaknesses of these models, so we kind of know where are weak points, where are we vulnerable, and then aspects of these models that we can't fix just more. We got to manage at the sort of at the social layer, right? We just have to kind of be in constant communication and be monitoring the system. At some point, we will tie in decentralized governance into this whole process. And then also, of course, the monetary policy as well. Everything has to tie together nicely, and hopefully it will by the end. Okay, so how do we go about actually getting this done? A few things that I want to emphasize. First is, I think the goal should be to keep the model as modular as possible. We want to understand how everything works, but there is inevitably going to be a lot of differences in methodologies. So for example, there really shouldn't be any disagreement from one risk team to another, from one risk model to another about what the liquidation ratio represents, right? There's a fairly static definition of what it's designed to do, but there are probably more than a handful of ways to go about actually calculating that parameter. And essentially, we want a risk team to come in and say, you know, this particular method that you guys have chosen is wrong, or there's a better way to do it. And hopefully from there, we can kind of improve our models and iterate. Generally, nobody in the risk team has an ego about these things, except for Rich and Vishesh, actually, who, in my experience, both of them do not like to be told that their models are wrong, even though it occasionally happens. But that's kind of the point, right? I think we all want to get good discourse going and try to improve on our models. And then secondly, I think at first it's just instructive to start from an academic framework. A lot of the intuition is much easier to understand from a theoretical. If you could have all the data in the world and everything that you needed, how would you go about calculating these parameters? But as I mentioned, a lot of these models are just intractable in practice, and we absolutely have to find and discuss pragmatic solutions. There will be simplifications to deal with these hard problems, but in turn, they will create other problems, right? And there's just trade-offs no matter how you go about it. We just want to be clear on what these trade-offs are and come to rough consensus on what is acceptable for us and what is not acceptable. Yeah, unfortunately, it's just a few problems are just unavoidable. So we just need best practices. And I think that's just what decentralized risk function is all about, is finding a solution and coming to consensus on what's the best path forward. Okay, so we're going to start off with a simple model with a lot of assumptions, which we will then relax one by one. We're going to be conservative in a lot of our calculations, because I think that's just the prudent way to do it. I think we're going to run our first, we are going to run our first example on ETH. I think it's the only collateral that we can all agree on today that will be part of MCD. Also, obviously, has the most data. It's most applicable. There's obviously no counterparty risk to ETH, which is nice because I get questions every single day about counterparty risk with a lot of these other collateral types, something we can deal with a little bit later. But of course, as we get more collateral types, certain aspects will need to change. So there's going to be a trade-off. We're going to try to keep things as general and modular as possible, with understanding that obviously specific collaterals will require changes to the model. Okay, so at a high level, it would be great if this was all the work we had to do, right? Unfortunately, there's a lot of work ahead of us, and I think first, let's just define our inputs and outputs, figure out where we're starting, where we want to get to, and then, of course, we'll talk about the journey there. Okay, so inputs. As I mentioned, first thing we're going to have is a collateral application, which is just going to have some general information about the collateral asset, the organization, the team behind it, some data on the token itself, it being trading data or token distribution. We'll get into that later. We're going to have a trading profile, obviously collecting trade history. We're going to find a way to deal with wash trading. For now, we're just going to focus on exchanges that we know don't use wash trading or don't allow it. There's a few services out there that kind of do this curation for us. I think that's just going to be the way to go. It's obviously a pragmatic solution for now. I think it also that's kind of useful for determining oracles as well. Going to calculate some metrics, daily returns, variance, all that stuff. In time, we will collect order book data as well for more robust liquidity analysis, but that's another thing that I think will just have to be an improvement or iteration later on, or if someone wants to help out with that, reach out, obviously. We get to start with a lot of CDP data, which is great. So first is a historical CDP distribution data of collateralization ratios, and then obviously our current CDP distribution as well. And for the historical distribution, what I'm referring to is something like this. So basically, per does this work, this pointer?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so per collateralization ratio bucket, we want to track the amount of debt relative to the other buckets over time. That becomes useful. These buckets are kind of arbitrary. We definitely won't be going this granular, but we will be dividing it into several buckets. Source for this chart is Vishesh, of course. And our outputs. Our outputs come in different categories just because there's obviously intermediate steps in the model. So some of the preliminary outputs, obviously our own qualitative framework that we submit and the risk rating that comes out of it, liquidity analysis. And the liquidity analysis will essentially be a delta that says for a given amount of slippage or liquidity, whatever, the stability fee will need to be adjusted a certain amount up or down. And then with this, you can essentially tinker with the liquidation ratio and the stability fee and say, well, I'm willing to allow up to X amount of slippage in the liquidation process and compensate for that with an additional adjustment to the stability fee. And then our risk premium will come out of this. And then, of course, we go back and add the DSR adjustment to capture what is the final or total stability fee for a collateral asset. Some more intermediate outputs when we get into the more portfolio modeling side of things. We'll have to look at correlations. We'll have to look at stress tests, simulations, economic capital. And then kind of the last stage in the process really is the debt ceiling and how much exposure MakerDAO can facilitate as a whole. The two main, items on this list in my mind are obviously the risk premium and the debt ceiling. Those are kind of the two big goals that we're trying to get to. Any questions so far?
Are we going to be circling back for deeper definitions of some of these terms? Like
Yeah, I think,
capital?
yeah. As we go through calculating them, we will, for sure. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about building blocks overview. This is going to be somewhat basic. I'm not sure we can avoid it though, because I think it's kind of important to lay the foundation for how CDPs and MakerDAO even works in the first place. And a great contextual starting point, almost like a metaphor, is just traditional loans. CDPs are self-issued, DAI-denominated loans, right? So I think it's extremely helpful to start by looking at how loans are evaluated from a risk perspective. Also, MakerDAO loans are actually pretty niche in a lot of ways, and it kind of leads to a lot of confusion, especially with this, with the collateral aspect of things. So I think it's easy to just do a quick background. Okay, so a few different examples, obviously hypothetical. You lend $100 to a stranger on the street, you're not getting anything back. That's obvious. You lend some money to a roommate or somebody you trust, they might pay you back, or maybe they're only able to get you back a certain amount of it. But alternatively, if you do lend a stranger who leaves some collateral with you, then that's generally okay, right? Obviously, this third one is the Maker model. And we can immediately see that there's kind of like a diverse set of scenarios here and distributions, and we want to be able to capture these different aspects in our models. And from just a simple example, the two areas to focus on are the actual default process and if they had any collateral with you in the first place. So looking at default risk or credit risk, a good starting point is to think about loss distributions, which is essentially someone trying to figure out the different scenarios in which they get some amount of money back from their loan, right? So in the example of the stranger, you probably get nothing back. If you lend to your friend, you might get some back, but you don't know how much. Could be $30, could be $50. So essentially there's like a bunch of different outcomes that can happen, a bunch of different scenarios. And really the simplest first metric that you just kind of want to look at is just the mean of this distribution, right? Just on average, what are you expected to get back? Or alternatively, expect to not get back, which is kind of the parlance for the field, which is known as your expected loss. This expected loss is just the mean of that distribution. And intuitively, without knowing what this distribution even looks like, and could look a lot of different ways, you know that what you expect to lose depends kind of on three things. One is how much you actually lent out in the first place, which is known as the exposure amount, the likelihood of not getting paid back, or the probability that the borrower defaults on this loan. And then kind of this conditional where, okay, if they have defaulted, are you able to claw any money back from them? Is it the case that if they default, you've lost the entire amount of the loan or just part of it? This is a pretty general model that kind of applies at a high level to all collateral types. And interestingly enough, this distribution also has of course, has a variance, which describes the range of how bad things can get. And we'll circle back to that a little bit later, but that becomes important as well.
Hey, Cyrus.
Yeah.
Question for you. this might be a little bit philosophical if you want to go back to the previous slide, although this slide could explain it well too. How do you think about a default? So defining a default, you could define, let's say, a given liquidation could be a default, but in that situation, you typically have a positive recovery rate, well, above 1 recovery rate, right? So you can get 10% back. So would a default then, so there's two ways you could go about it, I guess. So one, you could say a default is a liquidation that occurs at below 100% collateralization, at which point there is some loss. Or you could say it occurs whenever it's under-collateralized, and you could just assume that the recovery rate is above 1, which makes it a little bit more awkward.
Right. Yeah. I know exactly what you mean. So the best way to do it, and I think really the proper way, is that you define a default when the CDP gets liquidated, and then the amount that you're able to recover from the collateral sale gets baked into that loss given default. And essentially trying to find out the statistics behind what the auction looks like and how much you're able to recover. So if you're able to recover everything plus some, that's kind of a collateral adjustment made to the loss given default. And in those scenarios, the LGD just becomes 0 and you've just lost nothing.
Well, you lost, yeah, but in some situation, well, wait. So let me understand that. So you're not losing negative amounts. In other words, gaining.
No, you're not. We cap it to, and right, because MakerDAO does not gain anything. Even they return the DAO returns the excess collateral back to the CDP user. So they actually can't have a negative LGD.
Yeah, I guess I'm referring to the fee and how you're dealing with that in this situation.
Oh, you mean the liquidation penalty?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something to be factored in, but that's kind of a specific.
Yeah. I don't want to sidetrack this.
Yeah, we can factor that in for sure.
Thank
cool.
you.
Yep. Okay, so you can think of default or not default as kind of a two-state system. Very simple, but very instructive. So in this branch here, this is where there is no default, right? 1 minus the probability of default. And in this scenario, you get back everything, or this is what you're owed. And then in a scenario where they do default, you get back what you're owed times what you're actually able to recover from the loan. So your expected loss is obviously, not obviously, but the expected loss is how much you're owed back minus what you expect to get back. And this expectation here is calculated through this, this branch here. And you kind of do out the calculation, and it simplifies nicely to your loss being the likelihood that you don't get your money back times the amount loaned out times the amount that you've lost. This subscript H is just kind of the horizon. It's not really that important. Any questions on this? There's got to be a question on this. Okay, cool.
Well, Cyrus, there was a question on the side. I can read it out to you from Patrick again. Expected loss is capped at 0 in traditional models. I think that it's reasonable to use here. I think that's reasonable to use here also, since as Cyrus mentioned, it's not like MakerDAO is keeping excess collateral proceeds. So I think that was a reference to Alex's question earlier.
Yeah, and yeah, but as Alex had pointed out, there is still a liquidation penalty, which should get factored in.
Heads back into the buy and burn though, right?
Right, but yeah, we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Okay, so very simple example. You lend out $100, you might get back 100, you might get back 30. Let's just assume it's a 50-50 chance. The loss given default is 70%. Exposure amount is 100. Your expected loss is $35. So as a lender, you're expecting to lose $35 on this loan, right? Or 35%. And intuitively, you know, a lender would require some compensation for this in the form of a risk premium, right? And in this case, the risk premium for this loan would come out to about 53%. Is just kind of a break even, where over time, if they were to repeat this loan, you know, a bunch of times, this is what would cause them to break even, right? So the point here is we're trying to create a framework where you have an outstanding loan, and you want to be able to quantify what is the expected amount that you will get back, or what's the expected amount that you lose, and then trying to derive the risk premium from that. And so the big question is, how do we even calculate those parameters in the first place? Because obviously the ones I chose were extremely arbitrary. Trying to figure out what is the likelihood that any loan, such as a CDP or anything else, will liquidate is quite difficult. Even more difficult is trying to estimate or forecast how much you're expected to lose if there is a default, right? So in the traditional world, something that helps derive that is reputation, right? That's kind of what credit scores are for, where they say, based on your credit history, we've assigned you the score, and generally people with this score have a 10% frequency of defaulting on their loans. And they can just do this through a lot of data mining and, you know, looking at historical data over the past, you know, hundreds of years of loans. Typically, that's the way to do it, just looking at historical data. Of course, you could also look at non-historical or forward-looking metrics, or kind of a fundamental analysis, and just evaluate somebody and offer them a rate based on what you perceive their reputation to behave like over time. And of course, there are disincentives to default, such as obviously your credit score penalty, which is similar to the CDP liquidation penalty. And kind of a key aspect here is that when defaults do happen, there are still additional repercussions that sometimes aren't talked about often enough and are actually important here. And these repercussions are, for example, debt collection, and sometimes lenders try to come after your personal assets through the legal system. There's kind of a whole bunch of stuff that happens. It's not the case that once you default on a standard loan, that's just kind of the end of it, right? Which is pretty much the case with Maker CDPs as of right now. Now, oftentimes, for good reason, lenders sometimes prefer collateral as part of the loan, right? It's not necessarily a case that people just go around getting loans with just nothing on the line. It happens in some cases, for example, student loans, but there are many cases where lenders require collateral. And intuitively, as the more collateral they pledge, your expected loss is lower, because now you have a much lower loss given default. If there's a default, you, in many cases, just maybe lose nothing, right? So it reduces the expected loss. Also, more importantly, reduces the variance of your losses, which leads to some nice properties. It's a very simple example. Secured loan is a mortgage, where the collateral is the property. And in some cases, the collateral incentivizes repayment, right? Nobody wants to lose their home. But for mortgage, there's kind of two ways this loan can go bad, right? The the borrower can stop paying the mortgage payments, or the collateral value falls, right? Oftentimes there's insurance purchased on the collateral value falling. So in a lot of ways, they're still focused on the likelihood of repayment. But additionally, house prices are typically stable, and obviously we know that ETH is not. So we have to focus on the collateral, of course.
Cyrus, we're at the top of the hour. Do you want to continue on? Or?
Yeah, I just have a couple more slides.
Okay, cool.
So let me just finish up. Okay, so kind of the three kinds of debt that we talked about, right? Kind of just a pure reputation-based loan, unsecured. Some sort of hybrid where there's both reputation and collateral involved. And then we have just pure collateral non-recourse debt, which is actually what CDPs are. And this is why I was saying CDPs aren't necessarily a great place to start, because it's just kind of a niche type of loan. Interestingly enough, CDPs can become into these other categories if there was some sort of identity system in place, decentralized or not. Right now, it's just kind of the permissionless. Actually, right now it's more really the pseudonymous nature of CDPs that require this, right? Because there's no repercussions for, no one's voluntarily going to be paying their CDP back. And so this collateral only model requires us to update our definitions a little bit. A CDP has no term, has no scheduled payments. There's really no such thing as non-payment in a CDP. Default is now purely occurs when an asset hits some threshold. The loss given default is now what the expected liquidation value of the collateral is. And these become the two main parameters that we need to reason about as we continue our models. So this probability default essentially becomes, how can we reason about what is the chance that ETH just tanks to whatever, 150, 200, and how much can we get from the liquidation process? There's also a little bit of work to be done with the exposure amount as well, given that, let's say, there's a $250 million debt ceiling and only 100 million has been taken out. What is kind of the rationale behind the likelihood that that additional 150 million can suddenly be drawn or not? Okay, so yeah, that's actually kind of it for today then, because we're out of time. But next week, we can actually start digging into this stuff here, which is essentially we're going to use these to create some sort of loss distribution for the CDP and calculate the risk premium from there. And then we might, and we'll explore a few different approaches on how to do that. As I said, a lot of this is fairly academic and theoretical, and we'll see that in practice, it doesn't work out as nicely as we'd hope. So we will explore some, not non-academic, but non-theoretical models as well. Okay.
Okay, that was amazing. Thanks, Cyrus. We should probably try to figure out whether there's any questions. There was a lot of data there to go over. If anybody does have a question, pipe up now. Feel free to jump on the mic or type a question into the group chat. Cyrus, I'm wondering, because the volume of data that we're going through in these calls, and we're going to continue to go through, waiting for a sort of a finalized slide deck at the end of it might be a lot to review. Is there any way that we can get like
Sure.
These are the slides we looked at in the meeting, just like a tiny little deck that we can post to the thread.
Yeah, absolutely. Just help me offline on how to set
So
that.
I actually took a bunch of screenshots. I should be covered on those slides. I'll just post them in the summary.
I can share them with you
Yes.
guys. Just tell me the best way to.
The summary would be good too, because people are already heading there, so that might be a great option.
Yeah, I'm just gonna make it so that you could click a button and check out the screenshot of the relevant slide to the notes. So.
All right, sounds good. Questions from the floor? All right, so maybe people are absorbing things. If we don't have questions related specifically to the risk presentation, we can revisit it in the thread after the summary's been posted, give people some time to review. Matthew, I didn't ping you earlier to see whether you had a weekly recap for us this week.
I have one, but I want to ask you, do you want to go over the executive vote part first? We skipped over a little bit of where the polling was.
I thought I addressed it. Did I not address it deeply enough? I talked a bit about how we saw this first example of campaigning arise in the system, where previously the wait up until just the 11th hour was at 15. There was some discussion about how potentially it should be raised instead in the threads, and the maker was moved into 17 for the next vote. So next Friday, tomorrow we're looking at adding an executive for 17.5, which is a potential raise from the 16.5 we're at right now. So Matthew, if you wanted to give us like a 5 or 10 minute recap, that'd be awesome. We have time.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, it was kind of a continuation from the previous one, outlining, you know, what I'm viewing kind of like the greatest and the hardest challenges we're going to face. In addition to all the parts that Cyrus was outlining about how we're going to identify risk, it's also going to be how we can maintain the natural risk distribution of every type of collateral that'll be brought onto the system, from something that is in theory riskless, or as much of it as possible, all the way to stuff that's really risky. And you know, some of this, you know, as Cyrus was bringing it up, you know, the difference collateralization ratio, liquidation ratios, and debt ceilings. You know, it's actually a question I have just in general. You know, if the intent is to use those metrics and those 3 metrics only to somewhat to identify and control the risk for a given, call it asset package that we're going to put as collateral, you know, the challenge, one of the, I guess, questions I have would be, you know, when we start having the identical type of collateral behind it, say, for example, E, and we have a different collateralization ratio or a different liquidation ratio, the risk is different. And so the question becomes, you know, how do we, as a community, how do you set forth a system where assets that are more risky stay priced more risky? Because there's a natural tendency to bring that risk, and the ability to vote on it brings that number down. That of course is one of the questions, you know, and that's one of the points that I wrote about, was how we can try to identify that, and you know, in scenarios where asset packages basically become less risky, how they can be in effect refinanced, and when they become more risky, how you in effect, you know, drop the debt ceiling to 0 and force new debt to be in effect priced at a higher rate. Yeah, but that's really still the bigger concern would be really how the DAI savings rate is applied. Because if we go down the fundamental theory that not all the assets that are going to be placed, asset packages, will be identically risked, even with the collateralization liquidation ratios. And if they were all identically the same risk, then the DSR should be applied evenly for all of them, and it's somewhat a moot point. But when they're not going to be equal, then the less risky assets should be justifiably allocated more of the debt, the DAI savings rate allocation. When we have to create more DAI, when we have to absorb more DAI, the parties that are minting more of it because they have a risky asset, should not be weighted as much. And I guess the point really is to see how we're going to ultimately compute the die savings rate, and to try to have it be as algorithmic as possible to ensure that the weighting average of a risky asset and a more risky, risk-free and a risky asset are not in parity in terms of how they're treated. Because in doing so, we start to just inject risk into the system, and we do it unintentionally. When we, for example, have a risky asset that mints a bunch of die, disproportionately having, as David said, risk subsidy of the assets that are risk-free or risk much lower risk, raising the die savings rate disproportionately injures them per se, when in fact the party that was ultimately culpable was one that should just be adjusted with the what is it? We're going to call it the risk premium for that given asset. And that's really the question, is how we're going to maintain that and how we can put it algorithmically where possible. That was it.
Okay, well, I'm trying to sort that out in my mind. So can you, so there was a lot of questions in there. So is there one question, like is there a summary question that we can probably try and bite off?
How are we going, the number one question, let's start off, let's imagine multi-collateral die launch tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Are we planning to vote on the risk premiums per asset package? Or are we planning to vote on the risk premiums per asset package as well as voting on the DSR?
So I think we're going to do it separately, the way that you're not a fan of, but I think that's just in the startup days. And I think we're, at least in my case, I'd like to see that kind of, and I know I've mentioned this before, I'd like to see that issue in action as opposed to just assuming it's going to happen necessarily. Even if we knew it was going to happen, it would be pretty much impossible to predict beforehand what any penalty would need to be for any particular collateral, right? You'd have to actually observe it first, no?
It's not so much a penalty that I'm trying to say. It's much more of a, like, it's a simultaneous equation. That's the point. It's similar to how circuit theory works with gigantic loops of circuits put together. It's simultaneously computed. The point is, we don't want to calculate, you want to calculate the DSR. You don't want to set it manually, because of the fact that what we want to do is have the DSR be calculated and wait a week and realize that it didn't fix the problem, that we're not adjusting the risk premiums correctly. The DSR can't be the savior for a risky asset that mints a bunch of die. So if you take a spectrum and just picture, you take 3 assets that we start off launching, one that's risk-free, one that's medium risk, and one that's very risky, right? The question becomes, if the risk-free asset mints a bunch of die and the others 2 don't do anything, the die savings rate should fix that. And if you take the exact opposite, where the risk-free did nothing, the medium risk did nothing, but the extremely risky asset minted a bunch of die, what should the die savings rate do? And the point is, it shouldn't do anything. It should just stay there. And the risk premium, because it's a risky asset, is the one that should go up, not the DSR. And it's theoretically, on 3 assets, it's easy to discuss. When you have 400 of them, it has to be computed. Because if we don't start using an algorithm to compute it, we will naturally have apathy to the fact we just can't tell the difference. And we have excess die in the market. The supply and demand are out of whack. The price is 99 cents on the dollar. So what should we do? We should just increase the DSR by 3 basis points, and that'll get rid of the problem. But it didn't. We just injected more risk to the system because an asset that minted that die, that caused that 99 cents on the dollar, somewhere in that risk spectrum, is now misallocated, is now not correctly priced for its risk premium, and had a risk subsidy. The risk was subsidized by the risk-free assets or less risky assets,
So
because the DSR impaired it.
So, but a collateral's risk premium, its inherent risk to the MakerDAO holders, or to MakerDAO, is not dependent on its impact on the DAI price per se. It's dependent purely on itself.
Totally agreed.
Okay, so we can agree that at least, okay, there's definitely a risk premium that is solely calculated from the qualities of the asset, whatever, the liquidity and the fundamental properties. Okay, so we have that number. Let's just call it a base risk premium for now. Now, if for whatever reason this asset triggers, and let's just assume the DSR is 0. For some reason, when this asset gets printed, when DAI gets minted off of this collateral asset, DAI will be trading below $1, not because of anything necessarily to do with the collateral itself, but rather there's just not enough demand from people holding DAI, right? And that's why the DSR comes in to
that I think is the assumption that I don't think we should use the DSR exclusively as a demand absorption tool across the board. It should be weighted, risk adjusted in favor of assets that are less risky, because the DSR by definition is risk free.
Can I ask a question? So why it seems to me there's two separate, we've kind of been dancing around this topic for a couple of weeks. Seems like there's two separate issues. One is, how do you determine whether risk parameters have been properly calibrated, versus do you need to change the kind of universal nature of the function of the DSR and make it more targeted? And so my question is, okay, I understand that if there is oversupply, it is very simple to say the DSR should be calibrated to soak up that oversupply. Now, separately, there's a question of that functionality could be taken advantage of by a given asset if that asset's risk parameters are not properly calibrated. Now, the question is, why not just attack the root issue and fix the risk parameters for a given asset if they are improperly calibrated?
That's an excellent point. That's where I started off with. If we assume that all asset packages, and I call it asset packages because I just think of it as collateral could be ETH, but if we're changing the liquidation ratio from ETH as your collateral, imagine right now it is whatever it is, 66%, is that right? Or whatever the number is. And we change it, one from 50% and the other one to 95. One collateralization ratio now is at 150%, and we make another one 104%. Whatever, the numbers are different. Even if the underlying asset is identical, the package, the whole collateral package, they're diametrically different risk components. So even if they're priced correctly, even if the collateral package has an associated risk premium that's different, right? The two collateral packages are different. So how can the DSR be applied equally to both of them?
So I think the issue here is, I think your solution would actually in some ways unfairly penalize latecomers to the collateral pool. So imagine for a moment we only have a risky asset and like ETH, and let's say the DSR is 5% and everything is fine, right? And then we add a completely risk-free asset that generates a ton of DAI, and the supply outpaces and the DAI price falls. Would you then penalize that risk-free asset for having impacted the DAI supply negatively? No, because you're just, that would be unfair to the risk-free one because they just happen to be the latecomer, right?
Well, there's imagine it's like picturing a pyramid. As you drop in new collateral types, they have to get recalibrated into the risk, like call it the spectrum of the entire risk solution. And there are basically three scenarios every time you drop one asset in, It's not realistic to say we're going to recalibrate every single one of them every time we add any one asset. But we have to determine if an asset that was added, or in fact all of them, if the risk profile as it compared to the system as a whole stayed the same, became better in terms of risk, or became worse. If they became worse, you have to increase and change their metrics. And if they became better, you basically let them be auto refinanced down.
But a
But hang
particular,
on.
sorry, go ahead, Vishesh.
Sorry, yeah, I'm not sure it's the most like well-intentioned design to say that, for one, if there's a problem, like imagine you're talking about scales, and it's almost like you have many different. It's not a two-sided scale. It's many-sided, and if all of the scales are out of whack because one particular scale is over or underweighted, I don't think it's a great solution to try to solve all the relative weightings of those scales, versus if there's one particular asset that is disproportionately drawing out supply because the risk parameters for that asset make it too attractive or too easy to do so, then, for example, if donuts were a collateral, and let's say there was no negative effects, there was no risk to maker holders, et cetera, which presumably would supersede anything we're talking about here, right? Because if an asset is causing a bunch of under collateralized liquidations, that would presumably be the superseding issue. But let's say none of that is happening and it's just causing too much DAI to be drawn out. I could easily curtail tomorrow the amount of DAI that's being drawn out from that for CDPs for that asset by just increasing the amount of collateral that's required for that asset. And what I don't understand is why collateral requirement is not
the challenge, though.
one.
Yeah, but you can't change the collateralization ratio and a liquidation ratio after a given collateral package, but ignore the collateral packages out there. And that's the equivalent of saying, hey, I'm going to give you a house mortgage. Your house is your collateral, and that's great. We're going to have an 80-20 deal, 20% equity, and you start paying, and then I say, hey, wait a second, the risk profile just changed. Now it's a 40% equity deal, and you say, but wait a second, that's not what the deal was when we started, but it triggered a liquidation.
But it's ultimately a distribution of different collateral requirements for a given asset, right? We've talked about this. There's going to be many different types of CDPs for a given collateral. And so it's not necessarily about, for a given loan, changing the terms of that loan after it's been issued, but rather making loans that are in that range of types that we've deemed to be unfair, let's say, more expensive, so that people get priced out of those particular structures because those particular structures are improperly calibrated or unfair, and that effectively would also push people towards those higher collateralization ratio CDPs, because even though it's a higher collateral requirement, you can make it ultimately less expensive by changing what the premiums are.
There are two fundamental problems here. How do you always, A, ensure that riskier assets stay continually priced as being more risky? And the corollary, but one that I think is more dangerous, is how do you constantly ensure that the riskier assets, when the DSR is used, are disproportionately in favor of the less risky asset? Because if we use it to sweep the problem underneath the rug, because a risky asset is not correctly priced, we amplify the problem.
I agree with that. My guess is going to be that it's going to be less tenable to try to disproportionately apply the DSR versus to adjust those particular premiums on, a running basis or a more.
That's precisely why I want the DSR to be algorithmically computed, such that when we try to apply it based upon risky assets that are causing a problem or burning, it doesn't matter which direction it happens, where whatever the event happens and we try to adjust it, the DSR is only mathematically allowed to mint according to the risk.
I don't see how you can say what particular asset is causing a problem, even if it was the most recently added one. So again, let's say you have 50 million DAI from ETH generated, and then you add some some super safe bonds, and then another 50 million DAI is minted. And let's assume that the risk parameters for both ETH and the bonds were properly calibrated, right? So you have ETH in there, sitting there for a year. DSR is 5%, no problems, nothing. Let's say 1%. You have no issues. And then a year later, bonds come in, super safe, you have the right parameters, and because it's there's demand to leverage off of it, another 50 million DAI is minted. And there just wasn't enough demand for DAI to keep up with this new 50 million batch of DAI. Now there's 100 million DAI out there, and there isn't enough demand for it. And now the DAI price has dipped a little bit. You can't say that, oh, it's the bond's fault that the DAI is now lower, just because you can't, because then you're protecting. No, I mean that would even be worse, right? Then you're protecting ETH simply because it was first.
No, that's why I want it to be my concept is it has to be a simultaneous equation. We're going to know what collateral package is minting DAI or burning them accordingly, right? The real question is the other way around. It's not if you introduce a bond that's very risk-less, like JP Morgan issues a debt, we tokenize it, and you borrow a bunch of money against it. In that scenario, and ETH is the other collateral in this spectrum, right? In that scenario, right, the DSR is going to absorb it because it is proportionally on the risk spectrum less risky than the other collaterals that would be off to the right. The real question is when you have a homogeneous, happy system, the amount of DAI outstanding is relatively static, and you introduce the supermarket next door wants to borrow money against their future sales. We put it in a CDP, which is by definition very risky. Even if it's priced more or less correctly, if it mints a whole bunch of DAI and it changes the price, do we use the DSR for that?
But why would it change the price any more or less than the JP Morgan debt would change the price? That's what I'm not understanding.
They're totally segregated. It should change. If you have 50 million DAI that's printed from your left hand or from your right hand, that has nothing to do with the risk, right? It still degraded the price because it changed the equilibrium of supply and demand. The question is, when you choose to try to fix that equilibrium, which one of those had more risk? Was it JP Morgan debt or the supermarket around this corner?
But it's not about debt, it's about just general DAI supply, like total DAI supply. So the DSR should be harmonizing the total supply and demand.
I'm not disputing that to an extent, and that's the point. What it really should, but continue down that thinking, what you really should do is price the CDP that was causing this oversupply of minting of demand. You should increase the premium to the point where we need the amount of outstanding to go down. Using the DSR to absorb that would be systemically increasing the risk to the system. And we went through this 3 months ago and we had too much DAI in the market. Right now we increased the stability fee, the risk premium for ETH, to the point where it started to contract the supply because people had minted too much DAI off of ETH. Same concept.
So, but ultimately you're, I think, in agreement where you're saying that you shouldn't necessarily just use the DSR. Sorry, I want to be very clear. You should the primary function of the DSR should be to eat that oversupply, but the DSR should not be the only lever that is used to fix oversupply of DAI. That's ultimately what you're saying.
It should be disproportionately in favor. Everything you said is correct. It should just not be. It should not be equally weighted across the risk spectrum. It needs to be weighted to the less risky assets, because risky assets need to be priced correctly with a risk premium, and risky assets that have a higher risk premium, if the risk premium is too low, they will mint not correct amounts of DAI, which cause an oversupply, which can degrade the price. To fix that as a lever, using the DSR when it's a risky asset is not the correct action. We should increase the price. The question is, how do we implement that, both on the DSR side as well as correctly pricing the risk premiums?
Yeah, I think I may be coming around in some respects. So yeah, if there is, I mean, I think I can see it in the case of if there was a miscalibration, if the risk premium was set too low, then penalizing other collaterals to soak up the miscalibration is just probably not the right
The question is, but how do you find that right price? And this is where I'm going, is that if we the only way we're going to find out what that quote unquote right price is to ensure that the DSR can't be basically abused as it impacts everybody in the system.
So my one concern is ultimately going to be like whether you would actually operationally be able to discriminately apply the DSR. There's a process and there's a model for setting those risk premiums, and I think it would be more of a hot fix, less of a running process, to be able to fix those if they are improperly calibrated. But my concern is it would be operationally infeasible to discriminately apply the DSR.
Yeah, I guess in summary, the greatest point I'm trying to bring up is that if we both allow, maybe on a short-term basis we have to, but on a long-term basis, I just don't know how we as humans can vote on a risk premium as well as the DSR at the same time. It inherently, that is absolutely ripe for conflict of not being able to compute it correctly. Ideally, we just vote on risk premiums across the board on every single collateral package, and the DSR is determined. And if it doesn't work, we will know that some of the across the board, the risk premiums, somewhere in there were set incorrectly. Somebody was not paying the correct risk premium because it didn't have the desired effect.
I mean, I don't see how you could figure that out unless you were to add the assets one by one and wait, weeks in between to see if it's affecting the die price or not before moving on to the next asset. I mean, as a means of determining if the market thinks that the risk premium you set was accurate or not.
Well, this goes back to when you were mentioning the credit score component, and I drew it on whatever, my fourth grade drawing presentation piece. I went through like credit scores A through junk, right? And it probably is more of the scenario that when you've correctly dialed in the collateralization ratio and liquidation ratios, probably everything is in the A and the B range, and maybe some stuff in the C. Realistically, if the risk side has done their job correctly with the liquidation ratio and collateralization, we shouldn't ever really have any defaults that should even allow there to be a problem. Which means the risk premiums actually don't need to be that high, which means the DSR across the board is going to end up being a blunt tool. It's still, however, the only way to make this work in my mind's eye is to do, the simultaneous equation, wherever it's, three, Vishesh, correct me if I'm doing it wrong, but whatever, 3 equations and 3 variables. But in this case, that would be for 3 collateral packages. And when we add 10 more, well, it's 13 equations and 13 variables. And somewhere in there is the DSR that bluntly impacts all of them on a weighted measure. The question really is, when you put together your risk assessment, we spoke earlier this week with a group that's putting together basically a factoring tool for payments via DSR. And if payments with DAI that are done on a revocable basis over a known time horizon, I mean, that is as risk-free of a future payment stream as we can get. And the ultimate, that is the asset that we could ever use that is truly risk-free as collateral in a CDP. How much should that cost, right? That's one of the questions. That is the risk-free asset for all of, basically would be for Maker, all the way to something that has more risk. You just have to be really delicate not to bluntly use the DSR for everything, for all of our problems because it will create them. All right, Rich, I'm done rambling.
No, it's good. You anticipated me attempting to cut people off. So that was a good discussion, and I enjoy seeing Cyrus's will broken in real time. So that was good for me. We should encapsulate that into, like, it feels like this is a one-pager where we need to, Matthew, if you can summarize exactly what the argument is in a very targeted manner that people can absorb, and maybe we can continue this discussion in risk and governance chat room. There's things to be addressed here.
But only if the summary is done in finger paint.
Yeah, we want some more crayon diagrams. I really enjoyed that. We're at 10:30. That's an hour and a half for a call. I think that we should probably stick a fork in this one. Continue the discussion, please. In the MakerGov subreddit, we have a thread designed for specifically this purpose. I'm posting another link. We'll have a summary in there soon of all the salient points that came out of this call, and let's continue the debate. All right, thanks everybody. Thanks Cyrus. Thanks Matthew. Thanks Vishesh for the great presentations.
Indeed. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Vishesh,